And here we have the next speaker, Mr. Rahul Maroli, Vice President, Ola Cabs, and he would be talking on shared economy, insights on shared economy. May I have Mr. Rahul Maroli? Welcome, sir. Mr. Rahul leads Ola's car rental, corporate distribution, and mass mobility businesses. Over the past decade, he's been part of the leadership team of market-leading automotive and e-commerce companies. He's also started and built Ola's captive vehicle leasing company, Ola Fleet Technologies, and transformed it into the country's largest vehicle leasing company. He was instrumental in solving Ola's supply loyalty challenge through an owned fleet approach. Prior to Ola, he led the sales, operations, and marketing functions for LeasePlan, a vehicle management leader. He loves to mentor early-stage startups on product design, business scaling, and rapid growth. He is an avid golfer and a pro off-road driver. Ladies and gentlemen, I take great pleasure to give you Mr. Rahul. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, and good morning. A few years back, the word paradigm was like the most abused word that you would hear. And then came the next paradigm. And today, it's the word shared and collaborative consumption, which actually receives that accolade. Ours is an age of sharing. It's a word that you today associate with either transportation, with mobility, retail, or perhaps even media consumption. But in reality, the word sharing can actually be applied to every possible industry that you can think of. Right? There's absolutely no industry where the word sharing cannot be applied. Sharing is not just a very powerful cultural tool, it's also an economic force that will change not just the way you consume, but also what you consume and also how you consume. While the traditional economy was characterized by asset heaviness and control over means of production, the shared economy is a space where physical assets are actually shared as a service. In simple terms, it's nothing but you use technology to match millions of haves with millions of wants over a scale which was just not possible in the past. Well, the common perception is that the shared economy happened on its own. There was nothing much that people did. You just created a nice fancy app, generated supply, and then people just came up. And you thought that demand and supply automatically matched up with each other. The reality is that this economy too is subjected to the same market forces or demand and supply just like any other industry. Most common ideas in the shared economy space went through multiple iterations. They were not ideas that people thought of them initially. And depending upon scale, and depending upon consumer preferences, and depending upon your shareholders' fancies, you pivoted the business. Most of us would not be aware that YouTube started off as a video dating site and not as what it is today. Twitter began as a podcast site. Ola began as Ola Trips. When Bhavesh quit Microsoft to provide aggregated weekend trip, or rather weekend holiday solutions to people, only to realize very soon that it was not the destination, but the journey to the destination that was a challenge, or rather a problem here. And he decided to solve transport to the destination as the first priority. From there came Ola cabs and the point-to-point car solution as you know today. It's a mystery as to who invented shared economy. It must have been a natural response to the millennium value system. But reality is that it's actually here to stay. Which brings me one of the biggest challenges of today's times. Disrupting, executing, and creating value in the shared economy space. So let me break it down to its fundamental constructs, its fundamental parts. Share, first, as what is the concept of share itself, and then next, in terms of shaping or executing the entire shared economy space. Sharing did not happen on its own. While the fundamental shifts in consumer preferences were existing, it was entrepreneurs who actually built it up. And finally, it got executed by individual entrepreneurs. The biggest trigger for sharing was nothing but the undemocratic access to data and handheld computing that was available. Data costs went down by almost about 99% over the past 10 years. Device costs went down by almost, again, 110% over the past 10 years per unit of computing. Technologies both on consumer end and on the platform end completely changed the way you looked at demand and supply. For example, technology like GPS broke down the entire demand and supply to a complete granular level. Ola today works on something called a geohash hour, which is nothing but we measure demand and supply by a 2 square kilometer block, and we measure it by the hour. So that kind of a granularity in terms of demand and supply was not available 6 or 7 years back. Perhaps the only people who actually knew that kind of granularity in terms of demand and supply were your milkman and perhaps a newspaper supplier. It was not anybody else. It was not your if you were in the FMCG business, the nearest retail shop would have been about 300 meters away, and he had no clue where you lived and how you consumed. The only people were your milkman and perhaps your newspaper agent who knew that kind of granularity. The other larger factor apart from technology was a complete shift that was coming in terms of people consuming and people's value systems changing. That was nothing but the rise of the millennials. The millennials have a completely different way of thinking. They prize ownership, or rather they do not prize ownership. They prize experiences over anything else. They envy experiences that their friends have rather than the paychecks of their friends. For them, what's more important is that how am I going to spend my time and not how am I going to spend my money, which is more important. This is a generation which is unapologetic about borrowing or renting, and perhaps even considered it to be a smarter option. I work with a lot of millennials. These are kids who have passed out of Tier 1 B schools, perhaps IITs, IIMs, and ISBs over the past 3-4 years. None of them have an aspiration of owning a car. Perhaps in my generation, your first stop would have been an automotive dealership to tell the world that you have actually arrived. Now, these are the people who do not have an aspiration of owning a car. This is a generation that is far more practical. This is the generation that actually thinks that you do not need to own it to experience it, be it transportation, housing, entertainment, or even renting or using a drill. The millennial consumption is what most brand owners have actually realized and have recognized. And we are already seeing some early trends in terms of surge or demand, a surge or drop in terms of demand, depending upon which sector of the economy that you belong to, and how soon you have reacted to the shift of or the age of millennials or the millennial consumption pattern. There are certain brands like housing and automotive which are already seeing that shift in terms of demand. Some companies, some brands have reacted to it, some of them have not reacted to it. House ownership has gone down significantly for early age consumption. Kids in the age group of about 25 to 30 are no longer buying houses, they're actually postponing it. Now that's a very clear trend that's available in the market today. While economics of reality, meaning people wanting for less, people wanting more for less, and environmental consciousness might have also contributed towards sharing globally, but in India that's not been a significant factor. In India we are still not able to get tangible results out of it. While these are all external trends, it's the entrepreneur who identifies these trends and creates use cases out of potential consumer trends or consumer behavior attributes. I want to bring out two critical points which I always keep talking about. Two of the smartest disruptors of our times, Henry Ford and Steve Jobs. Ford clearly said that if he asked his consumers, the first thing that you think when disrupting is that you go across and create a survey and the survey, you come back with nice fancy results. He said that if he asked his consumers what they wanted, they would have told him faster horses. Another legendary disruptor, Steve Jobs, did say that people do not know what they want until you show them. And that's the philosophy based on which Apple has always innovated and disrupted. Which brings me to the next part of the story, which is nothing but the shaping of the entire economy, or the execution part of the shared economy. Now, demand and supply market forces never interact on its own. It's always difficult for them to interact in a shared economy space. We at Ola, when we started off way back in 2001, saw that there were a lot of cab inventory that was available unutilized across the country, largely working for platforms like employee transportation and corporate rentals. But from a personal use case point of view, from a commute, from a home to office commute point of view, there never existed a viable option, a viable, feasible, economical option. That's the market that we decided to invest upon, and all that we required was nothing but a platform where demand and supply could possibly interact. And that platform was not the app way back in 2011 because the mobile penetration was hardly available. That platform was nothing but a call center. So the point that I'm trying to make is that all of us look at disruption as using technology. In reality, disruption can be created anywhere, irrespective of availability of technology. Even a contact center can be disruptive, provided you're able to understand and build upon use cases of your consumers by understanding insights of consumers and what is the pain point that you're trying to solve for your consumers. While we set up Ola, we realized that this was a completely new category. We had a typical chicken and egg situation. If there is no supply, demand would not come in on the platform. It's like saying that, what's the use of the first person to own a telephone, and then who's he going to be calling? Likewise, the first person who downloads an Ola app or makes a call to the call center, he's not going to find a cab because the cab driver thinks that there are no customers around, so why should I be on the platform? So that's the paradox that we had to first solve. It's a chicken and egg problem here. What we decided to focus on is nothing but supply. I would speak about supply at subsequently, but let me first touch upon demand. We built demand on the backbone of extensive trial inducement. Consumers were not used to a service like this. This was a service that was completely new to them. They were not familiar with a service like this. So we had to build it on the basis of trial inducement. While we initially started off with paid app downloads, what really boosted our numbers was nothing but using referrals as a means of generating more customers. It's a fundamental belief that one good customer gets you multiple good customers. That really worked for us. That belief really worked for us. Finally, we did get to mass media marketing, but that was way back in 2015. It's not always about the brand when you start off. It's about execution. It's about creating or getting consumers on board by understanding pain points and getting them there. While on the demand side, we did have challenges like consumer adoption, internet availability. On the supply side, we did have challenges like driver availability, platform adoption, and cab quality. While we thought ourselves as a technology company, in reality, what Ola is an execution company. We are not a technology company. We are all about execution. The core of Ola is calling a problem as a problem and not as a challenge. The difference between a problem and a challenge is that you can live with a challenge, but you can't live with a problem. In my generation, we were always taught that you need to call a problem as a challenge because it's a nice word, it's a nice positive word. The reality is that you're not trying to be competitive by calling it as a challenge. By calling it a problem as a problem, you're trying to address a problem and trying to be competitive. That's the difference that we have in Ola. And that's the difference that we try creating. Back in 2014, or perhaps even 2013, there were hardly about 10,000 cabs available in the city of Mumbai, most of them working in the employee transportation business, and perhaps corporate rental to a smaller extent. We spent the initial few years trying to get that supply on board, trying to incentivize them, get that supply on board, and trying to convince them to adopt technology. We only managed to do about 300 rides a day a few years back, maybe 4 or 5 years back. While it's common sense that we would have thought that market forces would easily move in the moment we saw consumer adoption coming in, and then supply would also flow. The reality and the truth of it is that that did not happen. If we had to grow faster, we had to depend heavily on execution. Execution here meant setting up an entire army of executives and field executives trying to scour the streets of Mumbai for people with driving licenses but not doing driving related jobs. We then had to train them to become cab drivers, show them the path of entrepreneurship, and tell them why does it make more sense for them to become an entrepreneur, a micro-entrepreneur rather than driving for somebody else or doing some other jobs. This type of execution had not been done by anybody in the past. And there was no template for it available. We had to literally invent it, and that's what we did. We invented the templates for it. And by 2015, through our execution, we were already doing about 100,000 rides in the city of Bombay with over 20,000 drivers. 20,000 drivers just working on our platform and not we taking drivers from other platforms. And this is what we managed to execute in about a year's time. Disruptive businesses clearly require rapid scaling. You can't be happy with a 10% week-on-week growth. You have to be growing at perhaps about 25 or 30% week-on-growth growth because the base is extremely small. Another example is that way back in 2015, Ola was present in about 12 cities. That's when we decided that let's go out and spread ourselves across about 100 cities in 3 months, which basically meant that we had to open 15 new cities every week. And also set up and also ensure that consumers adopt there. It's not just partners or supply partners adopting us, but also consumer partners adopting us, which basically meant you have to break down the problem to a granular level and make it so simple to execute that anybody can go out and executing it. It's not about the idea, it's always about the execution. Most people think that it's the idea that fetches the investor's wallet, but in reality, it is not the idea that fetches the investor's wallet. It is the execution behind the idea. It's a team behind the idea. It's how well you are able to execute it. Now, shared economy consumers do not adopt things on their own. They have their own fancies. It's like any consumer. There is always a resistance to change. You have to ensure that you stay quite close to your consumers, understand insights of what your consumers want and how your consumers behave, and then go back and execute. In Ola, what we critically do is that we do not prefer surveys, we prefer insights. We prefer talking to consumers rather than surveying consumers. Each of us sit down and speak to hundreds of consumers every week trying to understand what is the problem that they have, and what is the problem that we need to solve, what is the pain point that they're sitting on, and what is the pain point that we need to solve. Shared economy and aggregation has got its own challenges. You do not control the means of production yourself, unlike perhaps the automotive business where you control the entire value chain, right from, to a certain extent, your suppliers, to a bulk of the extent, your dealerships. In the shared economy, since you do not control supply, you do not have predictability in terms of demand nor supply. More so supply, because that throws in certain challenges, like how do you keep your flock together? How do you ensure predictability of demand? How do you ensure safety? How do you define a brand where service delivery is not directly controlled by you? This opens up a completely different challenge, or a completely different debate in terms of how do you execute the shared economy space itself. Sharing is a completely different economy. It's about unlocking value. It's about unlocking value that sits in an unutilized car somewhere or unutilized home somewhere. It's about providing new jobs. It's about executing those. Sharing is not always about creating new services. It's more to do with creating new services using insights from consumers. While the current generation of disruption has already gone through, what's more important to understand is that the current generation of disruption came in from the WhatsApp generation. How many of us use WhatsApp or Facebook, whatever, right? All of us, almost the entire audience. How many of us use Snapchat? Yeah, there's one gentleman there, right? How many of your kids use Snapchat? I don't think any of us have kids that age. I assume it's a younger group. The reality is that kids of today are no longer using WhatsApp, they're using Snapchat. I'm just picking up Snapchat and Kakao Chat as one of the examples, but for them, sharing is at a completely different level. This is not the generation that uses Facebook either. When you look at consumers like them, we will have to come up with a completely different method or execution level of sharing. I can't predict what's going to happen in the next 5 years in terms of sharing, but there are some clear trends which are already available in terms of education and banking. Education, as you know it, is completely getting changed by platforms like Coursera and Byju's, which offer courses online, either paid or free or whatever means. The question comes in that is formal education itself required? Do you need to go to a college to learn? There's a lot of work that's being done in peer-to-peer computing, or rather peer-to-peer lending in this case, and that's completely changing the way consumer lending is working. The point here is that Anisha did talk about why isn't the automotive industry looking at shared economy and things like that? Why are existing players not looking at it? The biggest challenge for existing players is not living in the present. The biggest challenge for existing players is that they have a huge infrastructure that they have built and they are reluctant to change. What stops them is the infrastructure that they've built. A very small example is a company like Revigo, which is completely transforming the way ground logistics gets operated. Why couldn't a Gatti do it? Gatti had the infrastructure to do it. But the challenge with Gatti is that they have a huge infrastructure that they've already laid down, which is stopping them from doing it. Shared economy, or rather the new economy, can easily come in from any businesses that you can think of. It did not happen. It was created. It was executed. For the next generation, I think what's important is that we need to rethink, go back to the drawing board, generate back insights, and adopt each of our businesses to create more value. Thank you.